Welcome to today's video. We're covering the famous scholar's mate, the 4-move checkmate every beginner knows. I'll show you how to stop it and punish anyone who tries it. Let's jump in. The scholar's mate usually begins with the moves pawn to e4, pawn to e5. White then plays a very aggressive second move, queen to h5. The main idea behind queen to h5 is twofold. White immediately threatens to capture the pawn on e5 with check, and also sets up the 4-move checkmate with queen takes pawn on f7 after developing the bishop to c4 on the next move. Now, let's examine some common mistakes you need to be careful about as black. Many beginners who are unfamiliar with the proper defense might respond with pawn to g6, attempting to attack the white queen. However, this is a serious blunder because white can simply play queen, takes pawn on e5 with check, and on the very next move, white will win the black rook. For example, if black blocks the check with a piece, white will capture the black rook on h8, and the game is practically over in just a few moves, as black is already down a full rook. Another common response is knight to f6, aiming to attack the white queen and push it away. Unfortunately, this also fails because white can once again capture the pawn on e5 with check, immediately gaining material and leaving black worse off from the start. The correct way to defend against this plan is to play knight to c6, which not only protects the pawn on e5, but is also the strongest move in this position. White will usually continue with bishop to c4, setting up the scholar's mate idea, since now white is threatening to deliver checkmate on the square f7 with the queen on the very next move. At this point, the threat is very clear. White wants to capture the pawn on f7 with the queen and end the game immediately. As black, you must either block this threat or directly defend the pawn on f7. Many beginners make the mistake of playing knight to f6, hoping to attack the white queen. Unfortunately, this is a terrible blunder, because white can immediately deliver checkmate with queen takes pawn on f7. Instead of that, you might consider defending with queen to e7 or queen to f6, since both of these moves protect the pawn on f7. However, these queen moves come with significant drawbacks. Queen to f6 blocks the natural development of the knight on g8, while queen to e7 blocks the development of the bishop on f8. For that reason, these are not the most practical choices. The best move in this position is pawn to g6. This not only attacks the white queen, forcing it to move, but also prevents the immediate checkmate threat on the square f7. With this, black solves the problem efficiently while keeping all of the other pieces free to develop naturally. Even after pawn to g6, white can still try to continue the idea of checkmating by retreating the queen back to f3. Once again, the direct threat is very simple. White wants to capture the pawn on f7 with checkmate. At this stage, you must be extremely careful not to play careless moves. For example, a tempting move like knight to d4 looks strong at first glance because it attacks the white queen and threatens a fork against the white king and the rook on a1. However, the critical problem is that the pawn on f7 is still undefended, and white would immediately deliver checkmate. The correct approach here is to continue developing naturally. Play knight to f6, which not only develops a piece but also defends the important f7 square. This way, the threat of queen takes pawn on f7 is completely neutralized. Now, black is preparing to follow up with knight to d4 on the next move, which is a very powerful idea since it would simultaneously attack the white queen and create a fork. White must find a way to stop this threat. The best defensive moves for white are knight to e2 or pawn to c3, both of which guard the d4 square and prevent the fork. It is worth noting that this opening is not only played at the beginner level. Even top grandmasters such as Hikaru Nakamura and world champion Magnus Carlsen have employed this setup with the white pieces. However, at lower rating levels, many players turn to the scholar's mate in hopes of achieving a quick win. Because of this, you should always be alert. There are still many traps and tactical tricks white might attempt to catch you off guard. Before we examine the two main defensive moves for white, let's first take a look at a tricky sideline. Suppose white plays pawn to g4. We will call this cheap trick line number 1, because the immediate idea is very straightforward. White wants to push the pawn to g5 and drive away our knight. For example, if we continue with a natural move like bishop to g7, white pushes pawn to g5, attacking our knight. If we retreat the knight, white immediately plays queen takes pawn on f7, delivering checkmate. This is why you must be extremely cautious against this pawn push. Fortunately, this move is not sound at all, and instead of being a real threat, it actually allows us to launch a strong counterattack against the white position. The correct response is knight to d4. This move is very powerful because the knight attacks the white queen and also threatens to capture the pawn on c2 with a fork on the next move. Importantly, there is no danger of white capturing on f6 with the queen, because our knight is already defended by our queen. At this stage, white is under immediate pressure because of the looming threat of knight captures pawn on c2, which would fork the king and the rook. White really has only two reasonable ways to address this danger, either by moving the queen to d3 or retreating the queen back to d1. If white chooses queen to d3, the defense is too passive. We can calmly continue with knight captures pawn on g4, not only winning material, but also keeping up the pressure against white's already awkward position. On the other hand, if white retreats with queen to d1, the idea is to defend the pawn on c2 while regrouping. At first glance, it might be tempting for us to immediately grab the free pawn on e4 with our knight, but since the aim of this line is to demonstrate how to punish white's play as sharply as possible, we set our sights on a more ambitious plan. Instead of rushing to take material, we strike in the center with the aggressive move pawn to d5, blasting open lines and keeping white's position under constant fire. The move pawn to d5 has a very clear purpose. It gains a tempo by directly attacking the white bishop on c4. This immediately puts pressure on white to respond, either by retreating the bishop, defending it, or capturing the pawn. If white decides to capture with pawn takes d5, the game opens up sharply in our favor. After this exchange, we instantly unlock the diagonal for our bishop on c8. That bishop can then leap into action with bishop takes g4. At this stage, the white queen is under direct threat, leaving white with only a handful of defensive options. The most common replies are knight to e2, trying to block the attack and protect the queen; bishop to e2, offering a slower defense but giving away the initiative; pawn to f3, blocking the bishop while threatening to capture it, but also weakening the king's position. Would you like me to expand each of these three defensive lines in detail, showing exactly why they fail? If white tries to defend with knight to e2, this actually loses immediately. Black has a forced checkmate in just two moves. The sequence is simple: knight to f3 check. The white king has only one legal square to move to, and then bishop to h3 delivers checkmate. With only two pieces, the bishop and the knight, black wins on the spot. So knight to e2 is a complete blunder. What if instead white tries to defend with bishop to e2? In this case, the first step is to capture the bishop, since our own bishop was under attack. After bishop captures bishop, knight recaptures, and now black plays queen takes pawn on d5. This move is very strong because the black queen threatens the rook on h1 and also sets up the idea of knight to f3 check on the next move, which would lead to devastating consequences for white. Finally, let's return to the third defensive try. Pawn to f3, blocking our bishop and threatening to capture it. At first glance, this might look dangerous for black, but there is no reason to retreat the bishop. Instead, we continue with the aggressive move knight to e4. Although it looks like white can simply capture the knight with the pawn, this is not possible because the white queen is pinned by our bishop. The real idea behind knight to e4 is that we are freeing our queen to swing over to h4 with check. For example, if white captures our bishop with pawn takes bishop on g4, we simply play queen to h4 check. On the very next move, black is ready to deliver checkmate with queen to f2. The key takeaway here is simple. When your opponent attempts the scholar's mate, also known as the four-move checkmate, they are trying to score a quick and cheap win. Do not be intimidated by these threats. Once you know how to defend correctly, you can turn the tables with aggressive counterplay and punish your opponent for trying such a shallow trap. And that's how you stop the scholar's mate and turn it into a winning position for yourself. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.